The influence of the philosophy of Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung reaches far beyond just the psychological community. He is a mainstay among seekers trying to understand some of the deepest mysteries of the human condition. And in particular, if you're one of the millions of people who's seen this now famous interview with Jung.
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
I'm sure you, like me, are wondering exactly what he meant by that. What exactly was going on in that frothingly fascinating brain of his. Luckily, we don't have to wonder. We don't even have to mine too deeply into the mountain of words Jung gifted us, because he answered that exact question in a pretty succinct way, at least as far as Jung is concerned, in a letter in which he directly clarifies and elaborates on his thoughts regarding God and the great mystery of existence. And I think you're going to find Jung's take on this topic incredible, fascinating, esoteric, but also really honest and nuanced. I also think it's going to give you a lot to think about in your own psycho-spiritual maturation. I know it has for me. But first, a little orientation on Jung's spiritual background and his upbringing so we can contextualize this conversation properly. If you've already probed into this question a bit, into Jung's spiritual disposition, you know that he had a very complex, nuanced, multicultural take on spirituality. Jung was interested in the esoteric. At times, he had directly paranormal experiences in the form of dreams, visions, and synchronicities. By the way, I have a whole video on Jung and the phenomenon of synchronicity here that you can dive into. And of course, Jung famously had his encounter with the unconscious, as he called it, which culminated in his mythopoetic magnum opus, The Red Book. But where was Jung coming from? Well, he was church-going as a child. In fact, his father was a member of clergy in the Swiss Reformed Church. So although he did grow apart from organized religion, organized Christianity, he did have a strong religious upbringing, and Jung would acknowledge that that continued to reverberate throughout his psyche and throughout his thinking. But Jung's spirituality never stopped evolving. Jung spent years pretty obsessively absorbing and analyzing myth, religion, esoteric texts, and alchemical tomes, both Eastern and Western. Jung's unique mixture of rigorous scholarship and direct experience with the unexplainable led to a spiritual outlook that was pretty remarkable, especially for its time, and really still is, especially when you juxtapose it against the popular mainstream religion of today. And let's not forget that Jung approached information very analytically. He was a Western-trained scientist, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, so he always brought that analytical, scientific eye to these big questions, and he applied that wherever he could. Jung was always very resistant to labeling himself in terms of any ist or ism, so I certainly wouldn't dare to label the man. But he did have a few major influences that he acknowledged, and many other scholars have pointed out since. Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, alchemy, and especially later in life, Eastern mysticism. I think it's really important to establish all of the above because Jung's spiritual outlook and his thoughts on God were really not rooted in any kind of dogma. It was really rooted in a kind of perennial Gnostic mysticism that prized and took seriously direct experience with the unexplainable, with the great mystery. So with that context out of the way, what did Jung mean when he said, "I don't believe in God, I know"? Well, as mentioned, he addresses the question specifically in a letter he wrote to the BBC publication, The Listener. By the way, I highly recommend that you just read the whole thing. I'll link it below. It's only about a page long. I think there are two key parts worth highlighting in the confines of this video. The first is pretty straightforward. Quote, "I did not say in the broadcast there is a God. I said I do not need to believe in God, I know, which does not mean I do know a certain God, Zeus, Yahweh, Allah, the Trinitarian God, etc. But rather I do know that I am obviously confronted with a factor unknown in itself, which I call God. So the key takeaway here, of course, is that Jung does not know a specific God. He's not saying a specific God exists, but rather he's been confronted by the massive mystery of the unknown. A mystery so great and undeniable that he felt he had no choice but to call it God, because anything else is just too small. But it's the final paragraph of the letter that really fleshes out his thoughts that are both esoteric and pretty humble. And this is where you might want to focus in, because this paragraph goes pretty deep. I should consider it an intellectual immorality to indulge in the belief that my view of a God is the universal metaphysical being of the confessions or philosophies. I do neither commit the impertinence of a hypostasis nor an arrogant qualification such as God can only be good. Only my experience can be good or evil. But I know that the superior will is based upon a foundation which transcends human imagination, since I know of my collision with a superior will in my own psychical system. I know of God, and if I should venture the illegitimate hypostasis of my image, I would say of a God beyond good and evil, just as much dwelling in myself as everywhere else. So, what does all of that mean? First, Jung does not know there is a God in the sense that he knows the God or understands it in any way. Rather, as I alluded to before, that he has directly experienced something so powerful, so transcendent, so beyond himself that he has no choice but to call it God. Now for some important nuance on what the characteristics seem to be based on his direct gnostic experience. According to Jung, this is a force that's beyond good and evil. And then he makes the rather controversial statement that good and evil is really kind of a subjective distinction relative to the human experience, as this bit highlights here. Again, quote, I do neither commit the impertinence of a hypostasis nor an arrogant qualification such as God can only be good. Only my experience can be good or evil, but I do know that the superior will is based on a foundation which transcends human imagination. So the other important bit there, that it transcends human imagination, he's really saying that we can't, with our feeble intellects, fully understand God, fully even know what God is or what its qualities would be. And I'm sure a number of you are wondering about this word hypostasis. It's a tricky one to even broach, to even probe into. It's almost as tricky as answering the question, what is the logos, or something like that. But I think I can sum it up pretty simply for the sake of this conversation. What I think Jung really means here is the underlying states or underlying substances that are foundational and fundamental to the structure of reality. The most low-hanging fruit example of this is that for the Christians, this is the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. For the Platonists, this was intellect or nous, psyche or soul, and the one, the transcendent good. And by the way, if the Platonic hypostases and Christian ones sound similar, it's not a coincidence. Foundational Christian philosophers were highly influenced by Platonic thinkers like Plotinus. So now that we understand this term, at least from a surface level, how does this apply to what Jung was saying? Well, Jung was saying that despite the fact that he did have direct experiences with the great mystery of being or with God, he would never presume to say anything final about the experience or assign any final characteristics to this being, to this mystery. He's saying he doesn't know if he's right, that he wouldn't be hubristic enough to say that he understands anything about the nature of this force or of God, because it's too far above his perception, too far above the human intellect. And then another important point that Jung is making here, again, though he doesn't know, it seems to him to be foundational to the structure of reality. It's everywhere. It's in everything. And he points to sort of anthropological evidence for this take aside from his own direct experience. And this is illustrated in the following quotes. Quote, "I would say of a God beyond good and evil, just as much dwelling in myself as everywhere else." And on the point of that cultural or anthropological bit that I just alluded to, Jung elaborates on that in another article, which is also linked below. Quote, "When the primitive man sees the sun or moon, when he becomes ill and recovers, when he is faced with a birth or a death, he thinks immediately of God. But the rational mind of intellectual people cannot perceive and cannot understand. These people have lost their religious attitude toward life and are looking for explanations like mathematical proof. They cannot realize that to know God is not a matter of explaining, but a deep emotional experience which neither needs nor can be put into words." So Jung's thoughts on God, on what he meant by his answer, I don't believe I know. They're nuanced. To some, they would be considered abnormal. To some, definitely heretical, considering he directly says that he believes this force transcends good and evil, light and dark, really encompasses all of the above. But to me, his thoughts seem reverential and honest and humble. He especially demonstrates this when he says, essentially, look, this is my experience. I'm not presuming to know anything for sure. I'm just going to speculate to the best of my ability based on my own limited experience and intellect. So although we've covered Jung's direct answer, I know there are some of you out there who have already probed deeper into this question, probed deeper into Jung's more esoteric works like Ion, the Red Book, Psychology and Alchemy. Throughout all of the above, Jung does a lot of philosophical, esoteric, ontological musing. He even directly muses about God and what he calls a God above God, a gnostic being known as Abraxas. And to me, this appears to be the concept of God that Jung was alluding to in this letter, this God that transcends good and evil. According to Jung, this Abraxas really transcends all binaries, all concepts, in quotes like these. Abraxas stands above God and devil. He is improbable probability, that which takes unreal effect. If the pleroma had an essence, Abraxas would be its manifestation. What the God speaks is life. What the devil speaks is death. But Abraxas speaks that hallowed and accursed word that is at once life and death. Abraxas produces truth and lying, good and evil, light and darkness in the same word. And this is really just scratching the surface. You'll find additional cryptic musings about this God beyond God in Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead, for instance. Speaking of, in Jung's 7 Sermons of the Dead, a Gnostic text, which he initially published under a pseudonym, actually he attributed it to a real-life historical Gnostic named Basilides, but today you'll find it, this 7 Sermons of the Dead, in Jung's Red Book. In fact, it's really the summary, mystical revelation of the entire text of the Red Book. In it, Jung waxes poetic about spiritual matters, about the metaphysical, spiritual order of things. And I'll be honest, it really does sound divinely inspired. I think so much so that Jung didn't want to take personal credit for it, that he felt almost like he was channeling this, or like a higher consciousness was coming through him, compelling him to write this. Anyway, all very much worth looking into. Good luck wrapping your mind around it, though I think if you truly want to understand Jung's thoughts on spirituality and on God and the mystery of existence, you've got to attempt to wrap your mind around it. And I'll be honest, part of me does wish that Jung would have just gone out with full occult guns blazing, that when that interviewer asked him, "Do you believe in God?" that he would have said, "Yes, I do believe in a God above God, and his name is Abraxas." Could you imagine if he just left us to sit with that, to ponder that for all of eternity? Occulted musings and speculation aside, I do think Jung was being honest with his answer to that question. Perhaps he was dumbing it down a bit for a general audience who wasn't ready for all of this Gnostic terminology. But I do believe he was doing his best to be humble and honest and succinct in that interview and in these letters. You probably won't be surprised to hear that Jung's take on God, on the mystery of existence, really resonates with me personally. Not in the way that my thinking totally mirrors his on every point, but I certainly am with him on a lot. I love that he's reverent and humble, and that he focuses in on the fact that we live in an irreducibly complex mystery far beyond our feeble human intellect, but nonetheless does seem to be imbued with will, with psyche, with purpose, with unfinished business, and that we can at times experience this mystery directly, even if we'll always fall short of truly understanding what it is. And I have to say, Jung's take has really rung true in my own life, with my own direct experiences with the great mystery of existence, with the mysterium tremendum, for whatever my humble opinion is worth. And with that, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this transmission. Do feed that ever-hungry algorithm, if so, with a like, a sub, and a comment. And if you'd like more Jungian musings, aim your qualia portals toward my other videos on the topic of Jung, synchronicity, the shadow, archetypes in the collective unconscious, psychological alchemy and the Hermes archetype, and a ton more throughout the podcast catalog. Speaking of which, you will find some of our extended podcasts here on YouTube, but we've got over 300 audio-only transmissions that will never be published here, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops on Apple Pods, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And if you want to go a layer deeper, join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops, where you can hang out with me, guests you've heard on the podcast, and a bunch of other like-minded wonder dippers. You can also get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. Join our book club, and it's the best way to support this media vessel. So much love to all of you, my fellow sentient sacks of stardust, and we'll see you in the next transmission.